So hello everybody, this is Bhante Joe here, and I'm just here at the Dhammatunakuti and thought to record a short Dhamma discussion for the internet. So I thought I could start with just a little meditation, so we can lean forward a bit and arch the spine, and look about 3 feet in front, and close our eyes. And can spread thoughts of goodwill to our right hand side, wishing may all beings to my right be happy and at ease. May they put in place the causes necessary to be happy and at ease. And we can make the mind infinite, can make it unbounded, all the way to the ends of the universe and beyond. In every dimension, may all beings to my right be happy and at ease. And we can spread thoughts of goodwill to our right hand side and our left hand side, wishing may all beings to my right and my left be happy and at ease. May they put in place the causes necessary to be happy and at ease. And we can spread thoughts of goodwill to our right hand side, our left hand side, and in front. May all beings to my right, my left, and in front be happy and at ease. May they put in place the causes necessary to be happy and at ease. And we can spread thoughts of goodwill to our right hand side, our left hand side, in front, behind, in all 4 directions. May all beings in all 4 directions be happy and at ease. May they put in place the causes necessary to be happy and at ease. And we can spread thoughts of goodwill to our right hand side, our left hand side, in front, behind, and above. May all beings in all 4 directions and above be happy and at ease. May they put in place the causes necessary to be happy and at ease. And we can spread thoughts of goodwill to our right hand side, our left hand side, in front, behind, above, below, all around in every direction everywhere. May all beings all around in every direction everywhere be happy and at ease. May they put in place the causes necessary to be happy and at ease. And we can make the mind infinite, can make it unbounded, all the way to the ends of the universe and beyond. In every dimension, may all beings all around everywhere be happy and at ease. And before we finish meditating, can spend a little bit of time contemplating impermanence. How all things that are subject to arising are subject to ceasing. They're not me, they're not mine, they're not myself. And can open our eyes and do a short Dhamma discussion for the internet. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. So hope that everybody's having a great day wherever it might be. And was having a chat with one of my fellow monks here at the monastery a couple days ago, 3-4 days ago. And before we've been talking a little bit about defilement and these kind of things. And the Pali word for defilement is kilesa. And I've been discussing and mentioned that some kind of weird defilements, weird kilesas, come on the back of really close relationships. And so the Buddha doesn't generally recommend monks to have close relationships with anybody. And so later we were discussing again, he said, well, what do you mean by weird defilements? And so I thought that kind of that topic in general might be a good one for Dhamma discussion. So I thought to discuss a little bit about that. So it's interesting because when I was growing up in the West, there was this kind of religion had fallen away to a certain extent. Christianity had fallen away to a certain extent. It wasn't as popular as it had been, and people were looking more and more to science. And so for their spiritual fulfillments, with this gap left by religion, people put a lot of weight, a lot of emphasis on human relationships, on whatever relationships one might have with other people. And so even in these kind of movies, all these movies were around kind of, it's kind of the people would have these very intense romantic relationships, and there was a kind of underlying feeling, at least the feeling that I got, not just from the movies, but the vibe in general was that if you find the right person and become very close with them or so, then you'll be happy. Then you'll be happy, basically. And so it's interesting because the Buddha's teachings almost point in a somewhat opposite direction. There's a sutta which is called the Piyajataka Sutta. It kind of means springing from one who's dear, or born from one who's dear. In any event, what happens in the sutta is that I think it's a man comes to the Buddha and he's all upset because his only son dies. And the Buddha says, I'm just kind of paraphrasing here, I can't remember exactly the contours of the sutta, but the Buddha says, that's how it is, householder. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair come born from one who is dear. And the householder says, but who would think that? Happiness and joy come from one who, who's dear, who's very close. And so then he leaves and he goes to talk to some gamblers and he reports the conversation he had with the Buddha. And the gamblers say, that's the way it is, householder, that happiness and joy come from one who's dear. And so the householder leaves and he says, I agree with the gamblers. And so anyways, in ancient India, these philosophical debates were kind of hot ticket items and would become the general talk of people in the area sometimes. So news of this conversation eventually reached the king's palace. And the king reports to his wife, who was King Pasenadi, who was not a follower of the Buddha at that time. And he says, Malika, this Buddha, your teacher, the Buddha, I can't remember the words he used, but didn't sound too respectful. And he said, he's saying that sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair comes springing from one who's dear. And she says, well, if the Buddha says it's that way, then that's the way it is, great king. And he says, just like a guru, a pupil agrees with whatever the guru says, so too do you agree with whatever the Buddha says, or the Blessed One says. And he says, get out of my sight. So I think Malika was a queen. I think she goes and sees the Buddha after that. And she says, she sends a messenger, I think, one of the two. In any event, somebody goes and cross-questions the Buddha about what happened. And the Buddha says, basically asks if there was change or alteration in these various people that people care about. Would one become sorrowful? And it's like, yes. And then he goes on and he says, there was in this same Savati, just kind of paraphrasing here again, basically there was a woman who lost her child, and she went wandering from street to street asking, have you seen my child? Have you seen my child? And he goes through a list of different kinds of relatives, people who've lost their relatives, and they lose their minds wandering from street to street looking for relatives. Then there's also one where a wife, her relatives want to take her away from her husband and give her to another man. And the husband kills her and then cuts himself in half or something, kills himself, and thinking we'll both be together dead. And so the Buddha says, in this way, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair come springing from one who's dear. And in modern Western society, modern culture, there's kind of quite a lot of what you might call like external sensual stimulus available. So very intense, movies are very intense, kind of a lot of explosions, a lot of intense things happening, amazing music, kind of fully surrounded, fully immersed in these actions. Foods can be very intense, intense flavors, and kind of technologies allow one to experience sometimes these very different intense feelings. So one can go to a theme park and go on these roller coasters that are very intense. And partially as a result of that, people's minds can become accustomed to these intense feelings, kind of very intense emotions, and savor them and consume them. And so with the lack of, at least when I was growing up, with the lack of kind of balance from religion, people search for this kind of fulfillment in close relationships that one might have with various, with other humans. And basically put quite a lot of weight on that. And oftentimes in searching for these close relationships, the things that come on the heels of this closeness are these very intense feelings, very intense emotions. And basically these kind of addiction to these very intense feelings and intense emotions can sometimes bring along weird defilements. So this is kind of what had meant when I was talking to this other monk, that when one develops these very close relationships with people, thinks, this person's, the one, or like, we're always, going to be friends, and we're so close, so tight, we shared all of our secrets with each other, holding nothing back, and we're totally open with each other, we're like almost like one person, we're so close. That's when these kind of very strange emotions arise, when there's any shaking at all in that person. But it's not only that, even strange, very strange thoughts can come up in a person's mind when one is in this extremely tight relationship with somebody. And kind of fears about losing the person, thoughts about, what it was in the past, how a person's relationship's going to be in the future. And all these super intense emotions can come together and create suffering in ways that are extreme and unexpected. And maybe a little bit strange. Kind of a little bit unusual, kind of these very intense emotions. So this is the flip side of these kind of very intense emotional states, is that it allows for the sneaking in of these ways that the mind can go off in searching for these intense emotions. At least one of them is that oftentimes when people become addicted to these intense emotions or very close relationships that are based on intense feelings, then if things become normal, if things become stable, then it almost seems like something's wrong. It can seem like something's wrong in one's life. It can seem like something's wrong in one's friendships or whatever it might, friendships or whatever relationship that one might have, if things just become normal. And kind of one is just going through the day, doing the regular thing, it seems like something's wrong. And various types of suffering can arise based on that. Also, different defilements can arise based on speech. When one becomes very close to a person and starts to share too much of one's life with that person, any type of turning away from that, any lack of that closeness can feel like a betrayal. And in divulging all of one's inner secrets to somebody in this very close relationship, then what can tend to happen is that one's mind thinks about these inner secrets, thinks about bad things in the past, dark things in the past, and spins on that. So what the Buddha tended to recommend, rather than having these very close relationships, was to have these relationships based on the Dhamma. It's kind of one interacts with people for the sake of moving forward in the Dhamma. If one is a householder, of course, one has tighter relationships than a monastic. But even then, in the relationships the Buddha recommends, it's based on one's role, rather than based on one's emotional, more so on one's role than on one's emotional attachment and tightness to another person. So husbands are said to have roles, wives are said to have roles, and parents are said to have roles to their children, children have roles to their parents, workers to their bosses, bosses to their workers. And this is the way that the Buddha lays out human relationships, or the ideal interactions for human relationships. And when one interacts with people based on these kind of categories, based on these, more or less these duties, then it pulls one back from the tightness, from the closeness of that relationship, more towards a sense of basically performing mutual duties to help one another, more or less. And so monastic life can be like this as well. Basically, junior monks and senior monks have different duties towards each other. And basically, because everybody's either junior or senior, there's almost nobody who's totally on par, which means you can't form these really close, tight bonds with people in the same way that one could if one were, both totally equal and kind of melding. It's kind of not something that the Buddha recommends. So when one pays attention, this is the way one pays attention to his instructions. This is the way he lays out human relationships, to regard one's relationships with other people as, what's my duty to this person in this situation? It's kind of one of the main thoughts. In this situation, I'm playing this role. What's the duty associated with that role? And that helps to pull one's mind back from the intensity and closeness of these relationships. Now, one of the interesting things is that if one pulls one's mind back from the intensity and closeness of these very tight relationships, what it basically means is that one's mind doesn't have to tend to fluctuate as much. One doesn't have to be feeling this very intense closeness in order to be kind, in order to be helpful to somebody. One doesn't have to be feeling this very intense emotion to sustain one's mind. What it tends to do, that kind of developing relationships in the way the Buddha recommends, it tends to have a more even quality to the mind. It's kind of just the regular going through the day, work a day kind of supports that people give to one another. And because of this distance also, one doesn't engage in a whole lot of as much talking with the other person as one would need to. One doesn't necessarily have to divulge all of one's secrets. One doesn't have to tell every emotion. One doesn't have to feel like one is kind of melded with another human. And because of this, there's a lot less shaking. Because of this, there's a lot less fear. And this kind of shaking and fear and attachment, all the various, I use the word weird in this conversation with this gentleman, but I guess even unnamed emotions, unnamed types of suffering that piggyback on the heels of these very tight attachments don't have so much of a chance to arise. One's life can become more even. One's life can become more stable. Just kind of evaluating people in terms of one's duties to them more than in terms of one's tightness or closeness. So what this can tend to do as well is to put the mind more on the practice of the Dhamma rather than on the appealingness of an intense emotional experience. Because these intense emotional experiences are things that arise very strongly and then fall away very strongly. So I remember there was, one will often hear about this. People have these very intense, maybe friendships, or people might have an intense, heady relationship, very kind of intense emotional relationship with somebody, and those kind of emotional relationships tend to fall away relatively fast. And when one sees kind of in a country or a place where people have these long-term stable relationships, it doesn't tend to be the type of thing that's careening wildly out of control and kind of running to one extreme and another. It's just kind of a more stable and steady thing, and kind of a bit more, I guess you'd say, normal thing. So when one pulls one's mind back from this desire and attachment for closeness, one suffers a lot less when there's change and alteration in whoever it is that one has a relationship with. And these kind of unusual defilements don't piggyback in so much. And kind of one doesn't have all these kind of very intense fears, intense emotions. One's life becomes more steady, and when one's life is more steady like that, then one can turn that steadiness towards the cultivation of the Dhamma. Because the Dhamma is something that's much easier to cultivate. It's much easier to see defilements arising and passing away when one's mind isn't in this extreme turbulent state, going up very high and going down very high. It's much easier to see and counter one's defilements when one's mind is steady. So this is the recommendation generally that the Buddha has for his relationships, is not to become too close with anybody. So that sutta actually ends, the Buddha says, that's how it is, basically, that if one has one dear one, one has one pain. One has two dear ones, two pains. 100 dear ones, 100 pains. It's actually a sutta with Lady Vishaka where her only grandchild dies, and he says, the Buddha says, or not her only, her favorite grandchild dies, and the Buddha says, would you like to have as many grandchildren as are on Savatthi? And she says, yes. And he says, but is there ever a day that nobody's dying in Savatthi? And she says, no. So in other words, the more attachments one has, the more sorrows one has. So the Buddha's recommendation is to develop these relationships based on duties, and these duties are based on the Dhamma, based on doing what's good and wholesome, so that the mind can turn more and more to find a secure refuge within itself, and doesn't have to lean so much on one who is dear, on people who are dear. Okay, so leave that for reflection, and hope that everybody has a great day wherever it might be, and wishing all the blessings of Dhamma practice.